Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. Just the other day I was listening to a podcast/debate, what you want to call it, of a podcast and radio show that I listen to quite a bit called Unbelievable with Justin Brierley. He's based out of Britain, and I've talked about his podcast several times. He did a debate with a guy named, what's his name? He's an atheist named Stephen Woodford, and he does a YouTube channel called Rationality Rules. And I'm not, I guess I'm laughing. Sorry, it sounded like something we would have said in high school. But anyway, Stephen Woodford is an atheist, and he runs this YouTube channel. I've never heard of it. That doesn't mean that much because I don't watch too much YouTube atheism. The little bit that I've done, well, not a little bit, I've done a good bit in my life, but I've always been overwhelmingly disappointed at the stuff said. Anyway, Justin Brierley debated him, who, like I said, he runs a podcast and radio show in Britain, but this was a debate that he's been doing. Justin Brierley, after 10 years of doing his show called Unbelievable with atheists and Christians and, people of all different religious backgrounds, he does a good job hosting them. Well, he wrote a book a couple years ago, so now he's actually been doing a little more debates with atheists, and this one he did a very good job. Justin did it, and I'm not saying that just because I'm a Christian. I'm saying Justin did a really, really good job. And there's only a couple times when I thought his response could have been a little better. And anyway, I was very impressed. I was very glad. He handled himself very well, did a great job. What I thought about doing is playing basically two clips from the debate, and I wanted to offer my reflections on it. One is because I just thought maybe it fits my podcast, I think, pretty well, the kind of things I do. But it's not to say that Justin didn't do a fine job, but I'm going to give my responses, and some might be a little different from Justin's, but not that different. The other reason I want to do it is because I want to give some responses on a meta level, that is a broader level, things I might not have said, probably would not say in the debate itself, because it would have taken too much time. Time is limited there. And here I've got endless hours for your listening pleasure. Not really, of course. Anyway, my point is there are times when I'll say this is common amongst atheists that I've met, those kinds of things. I wouldn't say all those kinds of things when I talk to a person one-on-one, because I want to hear a person one-on-one what they say. So anyway, I thought it might be worthwhile to make a few reflections. So what I'll do is, first off, as usual, I recommend you listening to the debate yourself. You can, if you don't have podcasts, just go to YouTube. YouTube is free. And you can just type in, is it rational to be a Christian? Is it rational to be a Christian? Justin Brierley debates rationality rules at Oxford University. Or you can just type in unbelievable ? And they have their own YouTube channel. And it's probably the most recent debate posted or discussion. But anyway, unbelievable ? It's good. So you might find it helpful. So you might want to listen to the whole thing. But my first thing up is the first opening statement by the atheist Stephen Woodford. Here we go.
But with that said, know that despite appearances, I'm not your enemy. Just like you, I want to know the truth of existential questions. I earnestly crave to understand the world around me. But unlike you, I've concluded that Christianity is not only irrational, it's poison. So, on that light note, next question. If you could please raise your hands again if you're Christian, and keep them raised if you believe that life starts at conception. I'm not doing this to judge you, I'm just trying to find out a thing here. Okay, cool. Now, it's an interesting split, and considering that you all have access to the same divine book, and yet you have a staggeringly different views, does this mean that a portion of you have irrational beliefs? If so, don't worry, it's them, not you. What about gay marriage? Please put your hand up if you're for it. If you think that homosexuals should be allowed to marry, please put your hand up. Again, there's a split. And again, what does this mean in terms of rationality? You all have the same divine message, and yet you have staggeringly different views. Remember, this is divine revelation we're speaking about. This isn't some assertion that's been made at the pub. This is coming from an all-powerful, almighty God. You would think it would be a little clearer.
I'll pause right there, list what he's saying, and say a few things. One is, you can tell right away this is a fairly common thing, that when you listen to atheists who want to talk about Christianity, especially the ones that say Christianity is poison, as he said, and also says the debate, Christopher Hitchens had a big influence on him. And of course that makes sense, because Christopher Hitchens, his book was called Why Christianity poisons everything. I think it's a subtitle. Anyway, the point is, of course, Christopher Hitchens is dead now. He died of cancer. But when you start out by trying to demonstrate that Christianity is false by bringing up particular ethical issues, you knew immediately that we're way off track. We're just way off track. And I'm going to say this often as I do my podcast. I'm saying this as an encouragement if you're a Christian. If you're not a Christian, listen to this. What's also maybe you can just learn from this. Christianity is not about particular ethical issues. The hardcore root of Christianity is the life-teaching, saving death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. That's the core of it. There is a core. In the New Testament, there's a core. In the New Testament, gay marriage, when the life begins, these things aren't even addressed because, of course, same-sex marriage would be, an overwhelming, crazy, nasty, disgusting thing to consider for a Jew. And for most Jews, it sure is still around the world. So in the first century, that's not discussed because that would have been like discussing whether they should marry animals. To them, it would have been the same thing. And when conception begins at life, they didn't have those discussions. Later on, rabbis would have some discussions. So my point is, these ethical issues, even amongst the first century Jews and Jewish Christians, these issues were not the core of Christianity. So when anybody starts to bring up these issues, you need to ask the person if they know what Christianity is all about. You need to ask them about that before, in my opinion, before you even talk about the ethical issues. To say, I'm more than happy to discuss these particular ethical issues, but do you know what Christianity is about? I really ask the question, do you really think Christianity is really just an amalgam of various ethical stances? Because if you do, then you've really misunderstood Christianity. And the odds are pretty high. A lot of people really do think Christianity is an amalgam of ethical choices because most people think that's what religion is. Religion is just a bunch of rules. And so Christianity is just a bunch of rules, and your rules should be, that's your essence of the religion. The second thing I'd say is, when it comes to these particular ethical issues, when you talk about things like you think an all-powerful, all-good God would make these things very well known, I understand the point. I do understand the point, especially if you think the Bible, again, or for religion, is a rule book. It's a book full of rules that God himself wrote. Well, historically in Christianity, now you might think that, if you're a Christian listening, you might think that. I disagree with you. Most thinkers for a long time in Christianity would disagree with you. We don't think it's a book that fell from heaven. We don't think God wrote it, as it were. And that's what Muslims think about the Quran. We don't think God wrote it. We think most Christians historically for 2,000 years would say there's some degree of inspiration involved, that the Spirit worked through humans in their particular situations, in their particular languages, particular contexts, to compose the biblical texts that span about 1,500 years. But very few people in Christianity, and I don't know of any, that really think the Bible fell from heaven as a rule book. But most non-Christians do think that. They think that's what we think the Bible is. And so when you start comparing the Bible with the Quran, with the Book of Mormon, with whatever, and it all starts bleeding together, you're immediately going to have a lot of misunderstandings. And I'm not picking on atheists who are ignorant because they can't know everything about everything. It is staggering to me that people with profound ignorance would ever go debate anybody else in their respective field. That just, I'll never get over the shock of that. I would never go debate a person who knows a lot about cardiology or plumbing. I don't know anything about these subjects, and I just wouldn't do that. But anyway, a lot of people do that. And the last thing I'd say is, when it comes to these ethical issues, and you would think if God were so good and big, this is a very common response, and Stephen does this often, and you'll hear this in his talk. I maybe not hear a lot of it, but if you listen to the whole debate, you'll hear. I'm not replaying everything he ever said because it's about a 2-hour discussion and Q&A and debate. But he very often does this, and this is very common, and that is, the argument goes, it's not an argument, but they present it like it's an argument. The argument is, if God were this, then you'd sure think he'd do this. That's it. That's how the argument goes. You would think if God were all good and all powerful, then no human being would disagree on an ethical issue. Now, that immediately, if you know anything about logic, this is an immediately invalid syllogism. The premise one is, God is all good and all loving and powerful if and only if all humans who believe in him believe the same thing. Premise 2, his believers don't believe the same thing. Therefore, God is not, either doesn't exist, that's false, or God is not all-powerful and all-good. That's also false. In other words, whatever conclusion he thinks he's drawing from it, it doesn't follow at all. They do not follow in the logical rules. They do not follow. Moreover, premise one is demonstrably false. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And Justin says something about this later on, and I'm so glad he did. Of course, people have different views on things because people, real human beings, have free will. Humans have the capacity to understand and not understand, to comprehend, to miscomprehend, to read or not read, to listen or not listen, and to have different opinions on things. It has nothing to do with the fact, if someone said, someone's talking to my kids and said, you think your dad gave you instructions how to clean the room? What a stupid idea that is. You clearly do not have a dad because you'd agree on exactly how to clean your room. Well, that's nonsense. My children might say, no, they exist. We just were arguing over exactly what he said, or we're arguing how to implement what he said. Well, you would think if your dad were all smart, he would have made sure you understood it. And they might say, well, we both thought we did understand it. We both disagree on how to implement it. So, I mean, it doesn't follow logically at all when you have people instead of robots. So a lot of this opening so far is riddled with confusions. Let's hear some more.
Right, last one. Please put your hands up if you accept evolution by natural selection. I'll be honest, that is more than I expected. Progress. Okay, but there is another split, and that is predictably irrational. You'd have thought that Genesis would have made us all convinced that man was created by God, and indeed, most Christians throughout history have believed exactly that. In fact, there was a time where people like me would have been executed because I don't hold that view. But over the last few hundred years, scientific discoveries, that is, overwhelming evidence, has dragged Christianity into the 21st century kicking and screaming. And now it has the audacity to pretend that it's wanted to be here all along. Now, to the topic at hand, is Christianity rational? The answer is that it depends on the definition in use and the specific theological claims made, as indeed was lightly covered by Justin. On the one hand, if you lower your standards of evidence to make belief in Christianity rational, you simultaneously make mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive religions also rational, which is irrational, assuming that you accept the law of non-contradiction, which you do. Or very likely, I should say. It is, one might say, a Pyrrhic victory, a battle won, but at the cost of the war. Alternatively, if you exercise a healthy standard of evidence, as you do in your daily life on pretty much every other topic, you are left with no religion being rational. And finally, if you exercise low standards of evidence to justify Christianity, and a healthy standard of evidence to justify everything else, then you are committing a special pleading fallacy and thus are being irrational. These avenues and many more, I'm sure that me and Justin will unpack over the next hour. But to spend what I'd like to do with the rest of my time here is get straight to the root. According to the Christian worldview, that is, according to the worldview of Justin and most of you here, there is a God. And this God has the most profound, important message for you and I. So profound, in fact, that there has never been a message that's been more important, and there likely never will be. What's more, this God is all-powerful, all-knowing, everywhere at once, and all-loving. That is, he's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. What this means is that this God could, by definition, click his fingers, and instantly we'd all receive this most important message, and it would, by definition, be tailored in such a way that we would all accept it in its entirety. We would all be Christian. And better still, we would all be of the exact same sect. There would be no atheists, no Muslims, no Hindus, and no Buddhists, because in this case, God really would have written it on our hearts. Furthermore, we'd all share the exact same view on extremely important topics, such as abortion, gay rights, and evolution. Put simply, an all-powerful Christian God would be able to instantly convince us all of Christianity, and if it was also all-loving, it already would have done so. However, this God, with its divine intelligence, chose to convey this most important message, and with it the balance of eternal pleasure and eternal suffering, to a small group of people in a breathtakingly illogical, irrational way. And now, 2,000 years on, you and I have to rely on copies, of translations, of amendments written by anonymous authors with contradicting accounts and whose accounts have suspicious similarities with other religious myths. And yet, this all-powerful, all-loving God expects us to accept this abysmal evidence as if it's sufficient. And if we don't, this God will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger. Ask yourself, with all sincerity, how is that rational? Even if you strip back my hyperbole and bend as far backwards as you possibly can you really rationalize such absurdity? Would you accept such malformed logic in any other domain of discourse? A personal friend of mine, and indeed a hero, Matt Dillahunty, has said that for him, the aforementioned observation is the nail in the coffin for Christianity. And I agree with him, though I believe it to be more accurate to say that it's the final nail on the cross. An omniscient God would clearly know that such evidence is not nearly sufficient, and an omnibenevolent God would find it morally repugnant to demand that we accept the unacceptable, under threat of anything. Therefore, only an impotent or evil being would conjure such an irrational set of circumstances. But to be more forthright, if I possibly can, let me put it this way. If you believe in an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God that wishes to convey a message convincingly, and you are earnestly convinced that anecdotal, contradictory, anonymous translations, of copies, of amendments, of accounts of reality being suspended in a way never seen before or after, I fear that I can't help you, and neither can Jesus.
Okay, well, there we go. That's the end of his opening talk, and then he sits down, and Justin does his rebuttal, and they go back and forth. Say a few quick things about this. The first thing is, as I stated earlier, and I said it was going to happen, and it happened here, and he does this over and over. This is a very common thing. Not every atheist that I've ever heard or read does this, but this is a very common one. And that is, again, if God existed, he would do blank. If God existed, he would do blank. And that, of course, is not an argument. It's you might as well say, if my wife existed, then she would blank. And I've talked about this in podcasts before. It's just, man, that's not persuasive at all. If, David, you're not married, your wife doesn't exist. Why is that? Because if you said she's Floridian. And if she were Floridian, she'd be 6 foot tall with blonde hair. Well, why is that? Why is it you get to define that? You say, well, that's what it means. Well, God, it's different, David, because God is all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful, all-whatever. My response is, you're right. So where is the contradiction? And there is no contradiction, because when you start asking them what the contradiction is, they think all-loving means he would do X. But you have to convince people that all-loving means that. In a biblical worldview, there's very specific things what that means. So I have to ask the atheist, where do you get this concept of love? I really mean that. When it means all loving, where do you get this from? I need to be persuaded that your concept of all loving is accurate. The other thing, and it's just not, I find it, let me be real specific here. I find it very unpersuasive. I understand the point. I understand the emotional point, I guess, but logically, I don't understand it whatsoever. I think it's completely irrational, to use his word, as they'll say 100 times in this debate, because that's the topic, is belief in God rational. It's completely irrational to think that the definition of loving, by necessity, it must mean that God makes sure the fact that he exists is communicated to every human being. That is, to say that one more time, that a necessary requisite of all lovingness is that all human beings know that God exists. And that if a being did not make sure he knew that he existed, he is not all loving. I find that unpersuasive. I find it silly, quite frankly. I don't find that persuasive. The second major problem, which is why he brings this up as if it's contradictory, but it's not contradictory, is when he says God is all powerful. And he says, and he would make this message, this fact known that he exists, he'd make it such that all people would accept it. Once again, that's not contradictory, because you're missing an important point. And now he doesn't believe this, but I do, and that is human beings have free will. Later on in the debate, he will say that very clearly. He's determinist, and Justin will take him to task for that, and he should. A determinist believes that we don't have free will. It's just an illusion. It's just an illusion. And since we don't, in his view, since we don't have free will, we're just robots. God should, I'm paraphrasing, but this is basically the implication. God should have changed our software so that we all know that he exists and believe in him, because we're just robots. Well, if that's the case, I would say, sure, then he should be powerful enough to do that. But even if that were the case, that's not an issue of love. Love has nothing to do with that. But secondly, of course, there's a fundamental problem. We're not robots. We're not automatons. We're not. We are human beings. We have a free will. That's it. So he cannot make it known in such a way that we would all believe in him. I don't think that's feasible. Most philosophers concur. It's just not feasible. That's not what a person of free will. We always have the choice to say, I don't care if I know you exist or not. I know many people who know their parents exist and choose to cut them off. Maybe their parents are toxic. Maybe they do drugs. Maybe whatever it is. I was talking to a guy the other day and asked him, what brought you over here to this state? And because he looks like he's from some Latino country in Middle American. Or anyway, he said, oh, I came here because my dad and my grandfather are drug dealers, and my mom brought me over here. And I mean, he knows they exist, but he doesn't have a relationship with them on purpose. Does his dad and grandfather stop existing? But knowledge of existence does not mean for 1 second you want to have a relationship. And a very, very common charge amongst atheists is that, yes, it does. If you just knew God existed, then you'd want to just fall down at his feet and love him and whatever, and that's just demonstrably false. The other thing I would say is, so these are major problems. I mean, so I just want to make sure that's very clear. These are major problems. When you make the so-called argument that if God existed, he would do X, that's unpersuasive. And then inside of that argument, supposed argument, you have things that are not contradictions at all. Let me unpack a little more of something he said. I think, if I'm giving the benefit of the doubt, I think he thinks that knowledge of God means it's a saving knowledge of God. And because since he thinks that God, as he says this, I remember the exact quote, you can go back and listen to yourself, but something along the lines of, he will send you into eternal torment and wrath if you don't believe in him. See, he, and this is very common, I'm just telling you, when you talk to atheists, it's the common assumption. But again, I always say this in my podcast and my blog, always ask the person in front of you what they believe. Don't assume, but I often say this is common for atheists to say because I'm letting you know this is a thing. If you're prepared to think about this and prepared to discuss this, then you are prepared. You're typically more prepared to have this discussion because the person in front of you who claims to be an atheist, it's more likely that he or she would have this view. But the best thing is to ask them. But you can prepare intellectually, and emotionally ahead of time by listening to these kinds of podcasts. What I mean is that debate, and hopefully mine too, hopefully. So anyway, I think what he means is, he thinks, and I've heard this many, many times, the assumption is people go to hell because they don't know God. If you just had knowledge of God's existence, then you go to heaven. And if God were good, he'd make sure everyone knew him. That's it. So what saves you is knowledge of God. If God were good, he'd want you to be saved. And so he'd make sure that he'd write on the moon or in every DNA, I am Yahweh, believe it, that I exist. Now, I don't know what you believe as a Christian, but most Christian thinkers historically would say that's not at all. And the New Testament does not at all present the gospel that way. That is not the gospel. Knowledge of God does not save you. Jesus' death and saving death and resurrection is what saves a person. And now the question is, what do we need to believe about that? And that's debated amongst Christians. That's fine. There's exclusivism, inclusivism. How much knowledge of Jesus and his death and resurrection do you need to have? What kind of behavior is necessary? I mean, the Christians debated that for a long time. But what is generally agreed upon is that knowledge of God is not saving knowledge. It's a saving relationship with God the Father through the Son and the Holy Spirit. And that happens in the Gospels when a person, in the Gospels, in the ministry, in the first century context of ministry of Jesus, when a person hears Jesus preach or teach and then responds by reorienting their lives to follow his lifestyle, to adopt his values about what God the Father wants in the world. And this was called repentance. It didn't necessarily mean they stop what they're doing and follow him on the road. They might stop what they're doing in life, some other value. They might change their values and see the people in different ways. They would reorient their lifestyle and their values to match what Jesus was teaching. That's how they became his disciple. So they might know God existed until they met Jesus. They didn't have a saving relationship with Jesus at all until they met him and then surrendered to him. Well, that's how it is today. So knowledge of God doesn't mean saving knowledge. The second thing I'd say is, and this is not novel, it's a very common reflection. In fact, we find this in the New Testament. Demons believe and shudder, it says. Satan, evil. So if you're an atheist, this sounds stupid. I get it. Okay. All I'm saying is in Christianity, this has been talked about before. This isn't a novel idea. Christians believe there are other things besides the chimps that we are, just the mere chimps, evolved chimps. In fact, there are other spiritual beings. Other spiritual beings know of God. They have knowledge of God, but they don't have a saving knowledge of God. They know God exists and they're scared to death of him. They know God exists and they're going to be punished by him. Knowledge of God does not save you. So I disagree with his assumption that Christianity is a collection of ethical rules, or I also disagree with his assumption that if God were powerful enough, he'd make people believe something that does not follow. I disagree with his assumption that if God were loving, he would make sure everyone knew something. I disagree with that. I disagree with the assumption that knowledge of God is saving knowledge of God. I also disagree with the idea that knowledge of God alone is what makes a person want to love God with their heart, soul, strength, and mind. That'd be true if we weren't sinners, but we're sinners, and sinners by default are rebels. And rebels need to, as C.S. Lewis said, lay down their arms and surrender. And it's a kind of death. It's a kind of dying. And no one wants to do that in their natural state. I mean, we want to do what we want to do. There comes a broken time, a brokenness, a real kind of death, internal death that occurs when we finally surrender to his way of life. And people who have really done this know what it's like. They know what it's like. So it's knowledge of God is not enough. The last thing he says, in fact, twice, is one of the worst parts. Well, okay, in my opinion, it's one of the worst parts of this whole shebang. And that is the farce of, I assume he thinks is how the Bible comes through. Translation after translation after copy of copy of copy after amendment. We're supposed to have this stuff and believe it. This is overwhelmingly the case that in my experience, I have never met an atheist or skeptic who knows anything whatsoever about the textual transmission of the biblical text. I have never met one in my entire life. Ever. Every time I've ever talked to an atheist or skeptic about the Bible, they really do think the Bible we have today comes from like a dozen translations removed from the original. They have no idea that right now around the globe, people like me and much, 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 much more smarter people than I am have studied many, 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 many languages, and that we read the New Testament in Greek, and there's some Latin in there. We read in the Old Testament in Hebrew, and there's some Aramaic. And my level of proficiency in this is nothing compared to the people who spend their whole lifetime studying it. I mean, there are people who can just pick up any page in the New Testament or the Old Testament and start translating on the spot, all of it. And I mean, that's amazing to me. And they do different languages. I think people don't, I just know, not think, I know that most people just don't know that. They think when you pick up an English translation, they think that they're reading something multiple translations removed from the original. And that's abject. Well, it's demonstrably false. All English translations, in fact, almost every translation that exists, if whether it be in Spanish or whatever, most translations that exist today are predicated upon the most of the most recent manuscripts that have been discovered. And that depends on the translation. Like there's an old Spanish translation that's based off the King James Version, and that's also not very good, like our King James Version. But almost any modern translation is based off most of the best modern manuscripts. I say most of the best modern manuscripts because more manuscripts keep being discovered, little fragments here and there. And only the one translation I know of right now that tries to keep update is the NET, the New English Translation. In any case, the point is, it is not multiple translations removed. It's not multiple copies removed. When we read from the New Testament today in Greek, we're reading from the most ancient manuscripts we have, and where there's any doubt about the exact wording or phrasing, down in the footnotes, what's called the critical apparatus, we can know the best options of what it could be. Is it Lord or Lord Christ? Well, the manuscripts might debate that. Now, and I said specifically, I've never met an atheist or Christian who knows anything about textual criticism. The only scholar I've ever met who is a devout atheist and yet does know something about textual criticism is Bart Ehrman. And I agree with almost everything Bart Ehrman says about textual criticism. On the scholarly level, no, because I've read his scholarly work and I don't find it all persuasive. I'm not sure how much even he himself still buys into all of it. But on a popular level, and all his debates and lectures I've heard him do, nothing he says there is very controversial. The only thing that comes down to it is the maybe 10 or so textual variants that we're not very sure about, that every single scholar knows about. Bart thinks most of those are really big deals, and almost everyone else disagrees with him. Almost everyone disagrees that these are really, really big deals, and I've done podcasts on it before. But my point right now is, like every atheist I've ever met or read or come encountered with, except, and if you include read, that'd be Bart Ehrman's the one exception, because he's a New Testament scholar, is the fact that they don't know anything about that. They really do think the Bible is a collection of, that what we're reading is a collection of copy, multiple translations removed, and that's why it just sounds so stupid and silly. That sounds stupid to me too. I mean that. I would say, why would you trust that? You're so far removed from the original language, you don't have a clue what they said or meant. I mean, I would think that's a very good point. The problem is it's not true. Well, I'm going to pause there and pick up in part 2, and I'm going to unpack his closing statement. Okay? Hope you like it. Listen to part 2, okay? Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. At Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, or at Glimpse the King, at Glimpse the King. And I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in His great grace give you even just a glimpse of His kingdom this week. See you next time.